Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining this session. My name is Arjun Karpal. I'm CNBC's Senior Technology Correspondent based out of our new bureau in Guangzhou, China. This session is called The Future of Digital Policy. And just want to set the scene before we kick off and I hand over to our fantastic panelists. Technology, of course, is moving at a rapid pace. You've got technologies, the big buzzwords, artificial intelligence, to blockchain. And with these new technologies, as well as, of course, the opportunities, are major challenges as well, particularly from a policy perspective. What effect will AI have on jobs, on society? How do we ensure these kind of technologies are developed responsibly? And how do we make sure people's data is safe? These are some of the questions policymakers right now are grappling with. And the panel today we have brings together policymakers and the companies leading those technologies as well. Before we get to the panel, I'd just like to introduce Karan Bhatia, the Vice President of Global Policy and Government Relations at Google, who'll be giving us some opening remarks. Over to you, Karan.
Great, thanks, Arjun. Thanks very much. Thank you, everybody. It's an honor to be part of this this panel here today. Maybe if I could start with just a word of background about me. I actually joined Google about 6 months ago. Before that, I was at General Electric doing government affairs and policy for GE, so operating in the power, healthcare, media, financial services spaces, and before that was in the U.S. government working on international trade policy covering a whole variety of internationally focused sectors. In my time in the past 6 months at Google, I've been struck by how much convergence actually I see in terms of the digital sector connecting with other sectors that I've worked in, manufacturing and so forth, particularly as it goes through the next few years, a critical period. And so one of the themes that I'll throw out there is what lessons can we learn from other sectors that have gone through this relationship between being regulated, being somewhat regulated, and so forth. What I wanted to start with, though, is to share a few thoughts about what we see in the technology sector, what we at Google see happening in the technology sector today, and then throw out, to get the conversation started here, a few ideas about things that governments in specific should be focusing on from the policymaking space. So look, I think suffice it to say, the last decade has just been an extraordinary period for the technology sector, and frankly with it, the world. Coming out of the global financial crisis, technology, I think, was seen rightfully as a desperately needed accelerant of economic growth. And what started as the application of ICT technology to traditional industries has given ways to whole new platforms, new industries, new business models, and a blurring of lines where you have technology companies now active in many quote-unquote traditional sectors of the economy, and likewise traditional economy companies increasingly with a digital footprint or a technology footprint. Google, I think, is a case in point. You know, we began 20 years ago as a search engine. We've now evolved. We've become a cloud services company, an information and entertainment company, a healthcare company, a hardware company, and I think above all a company that's working to try to make access to the internet more ubiquitous, more affordable, and more locally relevant. I think today we, and frankly all of the rest of industry, stand at the dawn, though, of a very exciting new era that's going to see the further integration of technology and the technology sector with other industries. And that's an era that's really enabled by cloud, by connected technologies, and above all by the incredible power of artificial intelligence and machine learning. AI is enabling scientific breakthroughs, it's seeding future industries, it's uncovering new ways of tackling global challenges, and the range of AI applications really span every sector. You know, from creating new ways for doctors to identify diseases, to helping banks identify fraud, to equipping first responders with tools to get ahead of disasters, floods or wildfires, for instance. So I think it's fair to say that the issue isn't whether AI combined with other technological innovation is going to transform our economies and our societies, but it's simply a question of how fast it's going to happen, and frankly, which companies, which industries, and which countries are going to best be positioned to harness that incredible potential. So this is the World Government Summit. I'm not going to talk about companies or industries. There's other fora to do that. But I would like to throw out a few ideas about government specifically and what government policies are best focused on as we enter into this incredibly exciting new era. And I focus on three things. One, enabling access. Two, investing in human capital. And three, developing smart regulations. So first, almost self-evidently, the countries that are going to succeed, I think, in this new digital economy of the future are those that are going to have invested in the infrastructure need to develop and access technology. It sometimes bears reminding ourselves that almost half of the world's population are still not online, let alone accessing high-speed communications. And those gaps are going to become increasingly consequential. They're going to build on each other as technology advances. Whether you're a citizen or a business, a research institution, that need to use large data sets. For those folks, high capacity, secure communications are going to be critical, as well as the digital systems that are going to allow data to flow across borders and to access the internet. So infrastructure is key. To be sure, not all countries suffer from underdeveloped infrastructure. The country we're in today, the UAE, obviously is at the forefront. It has the highest number of mobile connections per capita of any country in the world. But as with many regions, infrastructure distribution isn't equal in the Middle East. There are substantial parts where even basic internet access does remain a challenge, and there are many places where it remains too costly. So I think one of the issues we need to confront here is what's government's responsibility on the infrastructure side. Clearly, prioritizing infrastructure investment, strong commitment to durable infrastructure investment is critical. So too is enabling the private sector to participate here by removing regulatory hurdles and promoting competition, and by adopting policies that will increase incentives for the deployment of 5G and other cutting-edge technology. Wealthy governments and international institutions that are active in the region, I think, need to prioritize digital infrastructure in their development assistance programs. And there's a lot that can be done, I think, with the public and private sectors working together here. Google, for instance, is very proud to be active in this space with projects like G-Station, which we've launched in India and Nigeria and a few other countries where we partner with telecommunications companies to offer free Wi-Fi hotspots. We're also on the other side of the equation trying to develop apps that consume less data or can work offline, like Google Go, for instance. So I'd flag that as one area potentially of conversation around infrastructure. I think a second is investing in people. Solving the access question alone is not going to equip countries for the digital transformation ahead if we don't have people that are equipped with the skill sets to succeed in that environment. In the Middle East and North Africa, only 38% of youth believe that their education right now gives them the skills they need to enter the workforce. And by next year, 2020, 1 in 5 jobs in the Arab world is going to require digital skills that aren't widely available today. So our belief is that there needs to be a very strong push, a very strong prioritization by governments to update youth education and integrate digital skills and resources into the schools. Learning basic coding should be part of the curriculum, just like learning a second language. And we also need to make sure that governments don't forget to invest in reskilling the workforce. This is a lifelong learning commitment that needs to be adopted to succeed in this space. Here too, I think governments would be well advised to think about how do you leverage the private sector and society, civil society. At Google, we've been very proud to have launched something called Maharit Min Google, which is really an initiative to help Arabic speakers, and particularly women and younger people, get ready for future job opportunities, to advance their careers, to grow their businesses. It's a program that provides free courses, tools, and in-person training around digital skills to help students or educators or job seekers. And thus far, we've educated more than 100,000 people, more than half of them women, and are hoping to do much more. But there are many other similar programs, and we think that's a significant opportunity going forward. So access, digital skills. The final area that I'd throw out on the table is smart regulation, and clearly, Arjun, you alluded to this. I think this obviously is the part of the equation that's captured a lot of public attention in recent months and years. How do you harness the opportunities that the internet offers while addressing the challenges it creates, including those posed by potential misuse of some of the new technologies? So around the world, certainly in Europe, the United States, and here in the Middle East, I think governments are wrestling with difficult issues about how to ensure the privacy of users, how to protect competition and consumers, how and when to regulate content on the internet, just to name a few. These are hard issues. They necessarily involve trade-offs. You could go to the extremes. You could preclude the collection of all personal data. But that would encumber a lot of beneficial services. For instance, mapping services that help you avoid traffic jams or find your way to your favorite restaurant, but do require location data to function. You could ban advertising, but that's going to force companies to charge consumers for accessing information. So in an era of, I would say, rapid change, which is really what has characterized the technology space, the idea of one-size-fits-all solutions are not likely to work out well. I think smart regulation demands a fruitful dialogue between government, between the private sector and civil society. At Google, we're looking to be a constructive participant in this dialogue. In the area of privacy, we've put forward a framework for data privacy legislation. And with respect to AI, we've put out some AI principles. I know that there are many other governments and companies that are involved in this space as well. Having spent the past decade working in a lot of highly regulated sectors, let me just offer a few thoughts before I conclude. First of all, I think regulation works best when it is government working in close partnership with industry. I always throw out the aviation sector as a paradigm of this, where you've had long-standing traditions of data sharing, of collaboration, of self-certification that have combined to make air travel incredibly safe. How do we replicate that model in the technology space, I think, is one question. The second is, I think regulation works best when it's technology neutral. In the power generation space, for instance, setting utility emissions regulations that specify what the emissions can be without specifying the choice of technologies has led to the multiplication of new innovation, new energy sources. So I think, again, we need to be thinking about technology neutrality in this space. And then the last thing I would say is the worst thing you can do is probably to limit trade or try to dictate market outcomes. The 20th century is replete with examples of failed and costly efforts to protect markets, to force import substitution. And I would say, respectfully, one of the reasons why I think the United States has managed to be at the forefront of the digital revolution is that it's largely not adopted that set of policies with respect to this sector. So let me finish, Arjun, maybe just on a quick note of optimism. I remain incredibly optimistic about the power of technology to improve people's lives. We at Google are incredibly proud of the services that empower billions of people, drive economic growth, and help people with their everyday lives. And it's important to remember that for all of this highfalutin policy talk, this actually really impacts people in a very tangible way. I was deeply touched by the story of a young woman named Zainab Al-Akabi, who is a young Iraqi woman who lost her leg in a landmine accident when she was 7 years old. Zainab today is a terrific YouTube creator on our YouTube platform. YouTube has allowed her to share her story, has helped challenge perceptions out there about what it means to be disabled. And 10 days ago, she was at the Dubai YouTube space, emceeing an event where athletes of determination who were going to participate in the Special Olympics in Abu Dhabi in March were paired with YouTube creators to tell their stories to the world. So I think that's an example of how the power of technology to really change everyday people's lives. And I think it's going to be up to us in this room, to governments, to civil society, to enable access, to invest in the infrastructure that's needed, and to think very thoughtfully about the smart regulations that are going to be needed to address some of the bigger challenges. So I'll stop with that and kick it back to you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Goran. That sets the scene very nicely. And I'd just like to introduce our other two panelists. Firstly, Margaret Peterlin, the Senior Vice President of Global External and Public Affairs at AT&T. And we have His Excellency Dr. Amr Talat, the Minister of ICT for Egypt. So I just want to open this discussion then, just based off kind of what Goran has said. There's a lot of talk about the challenges that technology can pose, but of course the opportunities. But what do you think, and I want to start with you, Margaret, what do you think are some of the biggest challenges facing policymakers today when it comes to digital and technology when they're thinking about creating policy?
Great, thank you. Well, I think there's two, and Karan touched on them, but I'll be able to elaborate on them a bit. One is the infrastructure opportunity, and it's really a challenge. So I'll give some data that's specific to the geography of the US, but I think we can extrapolate from it. So if you look at the infrastructure required to put 5G in place, a lot of people don't realize initially that 5G is an entirely new technology. So imagine a city that is not electrified, and you have to go in and put entirely new equipment in place. So if you think of the macro towers, which we've had time to make look pretty like trees and pretty like water towers, they aren't really the strong basis of that core. You'll be looking at microcells that, instead of covering several kilometers like a macro tower, cover 25 to 75 meters. And so that's a significant amount of investment. A lot of people don't realize that just in a geography the size of the US, AT&T is the single largest investor in infrastructure in the US 5 years running. And that's because of the investment necessary to get that infrastructure in place. So when we're talking about the infrastructure challenge, that's significant. But in order to get to the opportunity that 5G delivers in terms of low latency, in terms of speed, in terms of density, these opportunities where you can have instantaneous analysis of medical scans, when you can have off-site monitoring of patients, which really gives family comfort and also can save lives, you have to do that hard work first. And so that's a real challenge because you come into old permitting styles. You know, I always say that the permit you would put on a loaf of bread isn't the same you'd put on a slice of bread. And we have to be able to think about how governments want to interact with the requirements for putting the infrastructure in place. The second is data. And how I look at a lot of issues is some articulation of the data challenge. So whether it's cross-border data flows, which are incredibly important for businesses to be able and for consumers to be able to connect, or privacy legislation, or the GDPR. This is really all about data and how we want to treat data. And it's a problem that just articulates itself differently depending on where a regulatory body is in its interaction and where consumers are with their expectations of how the data will be used and what stage they're at. So, you know, some regulators are still talking about wanting to have access to source code. And some regulators are talking about localization of data. And others are talking about, you know, how we're going to treat it if you look at the GDPR example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're definitely going to talk a bit more about GDPR and the global state of policy. Dr. Talat, from your perspective as a policymaker, what are some of the headaches you have dealing with, I guess, the rise of technology, new innovations?
Thank you. Very delighted to be with you. Actually, there are several. Just to name maybe a few. In recent past, our challenges in setting a policy were more of a tactical challenge in how to meet a deadline or form a team or achieve a project in due time. Then we moved into maybe a technological type of challenges, how to embrace challenges regarding new technologies and make sure that we exploit these technologies to the best of what they can offer. Now it's more of a strategic challenge of how to ensure that you have a strategy that really embodies the full spectrum of the ecosystem that you're trying to benefit. We're dealing with a country here in Egypt that has 35 ministries representing 35 sectors and segments of the market. Our prime challenge is to ensure that we have a digital policy that really embraces the full spectrum of these ministries and make sure that it really is advantageous to the full spectrum of the industries that we're looking at. One project that we've set to maybe achieve or help us achieve an addressment to this challenge is a unification of the government databases that we have in Egypt. We have around 60 databases that spread across all industries and segments, and now we're creating a unified view of these databases in order to have a 360 digital view of our citizens. This helps us better understand the needs of our citizens and thus better serve our citizens and ensure that we know their needs, we know who is eligible for a subsidy, for instance, who is eligible for a help, whether temporary or permanent. It also helps us create a useful dialogue between different ministries and different agencies within the government, as we're all entrenched into this same project together. So we need to set a healthy dialogue on what is exactly every ministry, every sector is looking for, and the priorities of that sector out of technology. Another challenge that comes into place, and maybe we've heard of it before, is how to build a governance ecosystem that is protective yet not restrictive. We need to protect people on the internet. We need to protect the data. We need to protect the people trading on the internet. Yet we cannot have a restrictive framework that would maybe inhibit investment, inhibit more people entrepreneuring on the digital ecosystem. So you need to make sure that you strike the best of two worlds. This has a lot of questions and dilemmas, maybe to your earlier point of whether we keep data outside or we need to ensure that data is inside. Who has the access to see our data? Who has the access to exploit the data, whether in an aggregate form or in a discrete form? These are all very important questions that address people's security and privacy and address any country's ability to attract investments. A third and very important challenge that I think every government is busy with would be what I would call digital inclusion. We make sure that each and every citizen in a country really benefits out of the digital world. Each and every citizen has the right for a fair access, has the right to feel secure on the internet, same as he or she has the right to feel secure in the real life. He or she has the right to find a job on the internet. So it is our responsibility and duty, not only as government, but the full stakeholders of the digital world has the responsibility to make sure that we build capacity that evolves and caters to the new world. Every day now, jobs disappear and other jobs are created. And we need to ensure that people who are seeking jobs, especially youngsters and freshmen, do have the opportunity to be exposed to the right science, to the right disciplines that would help them find the job.
So let's try and answer some of those questions by taking stock, I guess, of the global state of digital policy at the moment. And to be a bit nuanced, digital can be about privacy, it can be about tax even, and of course all these other areas. So, I mean, one of the biggest pieces of digital policy is the GDPR, which you mentioned, of course, Margaret, which came into effect in Europe. But then you've also, the way I see kind of the global landscape right now, it's super fragmented when it comes to policy. You've got the US talking about one thing, you, Dr. Talat, are talking about an Egyptian-specific example, GDPR in Europe as well. So, Goran, from your point, as a global firm, I mean, how difficult does this make your job? And should we be actually pushing towards a global digital policy of some sort?
Well, look, fragmentation is tough in the, fragmentation of regulation for global multinationals is tough regardless of what area you want to talk about. You're right. I mean, we are seeing that happening in the privacy space. We're seeing it happen more broadly in the digital policy space. GDPR was a significant step forward, and Now we are seeing, I mean, your allusion to the United States, yes, there's discussion of federal privacy legislation, which we're actually very supportive of comprehensive privacy legislation, but you're also seeing it actually now happen at the state level as well, where you've had California adopt bills, other states looking at adopting bills. And look, the reality is that large companies can probably navigate very complicated, somewhat inconsistent regulatory environments, but smaller companies are going to have a much harder time doing so. And you're probably not going to get the best set of outcomes for the people that you ultimately care about, really users. So look, some coordination on this, some level of collaboration, I think is going to be absolutely critical. We're very supportive of international efforts, excuse me, on multiple fronts to sort of create the that level of dialogue and ideally common rules of the road, and whether there are multiple different regulatory fora that deal with these kinds of things. But yeah, I think it would be extremely helpful if there was some convergence.
Yeah, and particularly I guess in the US example, from your perspective, I assume it'd be good if there was a federal piece of legislation about privacy.
Yeah, I think Karan's right. AT&T is a global firm as well, faces some of the same questions. At the same time, there's also a moment that every company and every country needs to take to figure out where is the cultural comfort with privacy. And so you find that there's a phrase that is sometimes used in the US that, where is the current creepy line? And that means the line of, as an ad follows you across the internet, are you uncomfortable or are you comfortable with that? And so I think a lot of consumers, and we have 300 million direct-to-consumer relationships at AT&T around the world, and so we have consumers who have different preferences. We have sometimes generational consumers who are very comfortable sharing a lot of data for free services. And then we have consumers who would say, I'm less comfortable doing that, and so I don't want to share as much of my data, and I want to have more control over it. So I think from a large multinational firm perspective, convergence is a good thing. And I really want to underscore what Karan said. The opportunity of 5G is to take a population base of, say, 2.7 million, so a little smaller city than Dubai. And we think that there's an opportunity for 90,000 jobs to be created in that new economy where you have the low latency and high density. And so we also don't want to have requirements that only sophisticated, deeply staffed firms can participate, because those 90,000 jobs, for instance, on a city the size of 2.7 million, aren't going to start off as 500-person firms or 1,000-person firms. They're going to start off as 5 guys and 5 gals who are coming together with an idea and trying to engage in the economy. So what we would say is, yes, in the US, going back to the particular jurisdiction you raised, yes, we'd like to see federal legislation. And part of the reason why is we think it's really important to provide consistency for consumers. So if you think about the geography there, I live in a state called Virginia. I work in a place called DC. I've got friends in this place called Maryland. This is all 15 or 20 minutes away from my house. I don't really want to have to look at my child and say, hang up the phone, close that app, the privacy regime is changing, And so I think it's really important that we be in a position to provide consistency for our consumers. At the same time, we're interested in regulations that promote innovation and then also protect their data. But again, protect data consistent to what they feel needs to be protected, and then open in places where they actually think there's a value to exchange their data.
Dr. Talat, when GDPR happened and it came into effect, how did you look at it from Egypt? Did you think it's a good framework for what you want to do? Would you adopt something similar over there? Because there was a lot of talk, I know in the US about potentially using this as the blueprint for any kind of privacy legislation that comes down the line. So how did you view it?
We just promulgated the data privacy law. We definitely took into account what the GDPR has done. It's definitely, as you said, a reference that we should be taking into consideration when we do our own bill, which we've done. However, there is another challenge that we need to look at when we look into the legal framework is how to align the different interests of different stakeholders. The interests of governments and what they're trying to provide to the citizens, the interests of companies and what they're trying to achieve in their business interest, and then the interest of the citizens and their privacy and their sense of security dealing with the digital world. As I said earlier, it is extremely important for any consumer to feel as secure in front of his or her computer as he feels walking in the street or dealing with the shop. And this is a delicate balance between these different interests, and any successful legislation should try to strike this balance, which we found a challenge. The way we embrace this challenge is by a dialogue between the companies that we've invited in the ministry, and had a discussion of what would they want to see in a data privacy bill. And then we had another discussion with the civil society and what consumers that they are representing would like to see in such a bill. And then we added the government interest, and we tried to blend this all together, this set of different sets of interests together, and make sure that the legislation do cater for all of it.
And GDPR, of course, is across the entire European Union. Would you prefer to see, rather than just an Egypt-specific policy, a Middle East and North Africa policy? Would that be more fruitful?
That would definitely be great, and maybe out of this panel, I would invite each and every one of my colleagues in the Arab world and the Middle East world to take a look at our legislation, which has just been promulgated. We're ready to help and cooperate and unify further with our neighbors, definitely.
Karan, I wanted to get the Google perspective on GDPR because it's very close to it. I'd say there was a recent fine from the French regulators on Google to the tune of 50 million euros. Do you think this was the right way to regulate businesses like yours, or has it materially changed your business, or could it potentially materially change your business model in Europe? So is this the right way to do it? Was it too much, or was it just enough?
So we obviously invested an enormous amount, as you can imagine, in both the run-up to GDPR and then have subsequently in the implementation of the really the compliance systems that are basically occasioned by GDPR. I think the short answer to your question is it's still early days, and we're going to see how GDPR sort of plays out over the course of time. The data protection authorities of Europe are still sort of trying to wrestle with how it's going to get applied. I think we remain very much eager to work with them as they sort of think through that process. So, look, I would say at this point, it's been, we've been spending most of our time trying to make sure we've got everything in place and sort of pushing that forward. And it has, thus far, we feel pretty good about how that's playing out, but still very early days on GDPR, and we continue to have the issue that you referenced before about the multiplication of different potential privacy regimes going forward. If I could just very quickly come back to the point that Dr. Talat made, which is the idea of thinking about some form of regional standardization, whether it's around privacy or elsewhere. I really do think that, and again, this isn't just limited to the digital policy space and technology policy space. I think as you look at the scale of the region and the opportunities that exist if there were greater integration, whether it's around regulatory standards or the further integration of markets, that is an incredibly exciting, I think, opportunity. I really do think that's true, and applaud the minister's invitation to sort of see how that could happen, because look, if that did occur, I think you would see it be a real stimulus to investment. I think you'd see companies that right now can operate in one space, in one way, in one country, being able to do so much more broadly. And particularly for sort of your startup, your small and medium-sized enterprise, I think that's an incredibly exciting opportunity.
Do you have any ideas on how that might happen? Because of course the Europe example is this we had the EU.
Right.
This existed, this
Yeah.
block of countries.
Yeah.
And there was a kind of already a commonality in some sense,
Yeah.
even though there was a diverse range of countries. It seems a lot more diverse in this particular region. So how do you tackle that?
It is, but I guess I would throw out a couple of ideas. One, I mean, there certainly are institutions. I mean, we see the GCC with initiatives. We see regional fora of various types. So it's not that there isn't the opportunity there. And the second thing I would say is, this is a new space, right? I mean, it's one thing when it comes to regulating old style industries or we're in a very dynamic and somewhat nascent moment here, I think, in the regulation of technology and of the digital space. So to some extent, the absence of set in stone models everywhere, I think, gives an opportunity for potentially more convergence.
Margaret, I want to ask you something that actually Karan mentioned in his opening remarks about the importance of the relationship between public and private in creating legislation. One thing that kind of stood out about GDPR is there was this kind of sense, whether true or not, that it was kind of created in Brussels and just kind of slapped down, and this was here, and it was in the works for a while. But I mean, when it comes to one of the things you've spoken about, 5G in the US, how closely are you working with government in creating this policy? 5G has become obviously extremely politicized at the moment. It's a very crucial technology as seen by the government. So what's your kind of involvement right now in that, in building a regulation framework to roll out 5G?
Yeah, I think I would sort of go back and underscore some of the points I made about it's an infrastructure project to get 5G in place. And AT&T, while we're a modern media company with our CNN assets and our Warner Media assets, we also really have still in our core the telecommunications business unit. And so when I look at that relationship, sure, when you're moving from putting in macro towers to micro towers, it's a different discussion. So for instance, across some of the jurisdictions in the US and working very closely with our primary regulator, the FCC, the towers needed to be 10 meters above the ground. You go into some cities, there aren't buildings that are that tall. So you have to be able to have a conversation that says, okay, we're going to install infrastructure. We need to be able to install it to something that's in place. And so I think in any regulation situation, you want to have a healthy dialogue. I mean, I have been in the public sector as well. I was at the Department of Commerce for a period of time and focusing particularly on innovation. And so when I was there, I wanted to talk to industry. I wanted industry to come and tell me, what are the things I don't understand about installing equipment on the ground? And so you would have that conversation. So I think you would see, and especially in infrastructure discussions, you would expect any company, so you would expect our competitors, Verizon and Sprint and T-Mo, to also be going in and having the conversations. And you'd also expect your regulators to say, please come in and explain it, because we're actually interested in helping the same thing. We're all trying to grow jobs. And 5G is a great example. I mentioned on a city of 2.7 million, 90,000 jobs, but we think broadly on a population base of about 300 million, that it's 3 million jobs and $500 billion added to the economy. And so regulators want to be involved in a discussion that talks about how can we efficiently safeguard the things that need to be cared for, and how can we make sure that we're not going so far that we're taking $500 billion growth opportunity and turning it into $7 billion growth opportunity instead. So I think, having been on the regulator side and now in the private sector again, I think it's a pretty healthy discussion to just talk about the brass tacks, because the goals are common. Regulators may call them constituents, we call them consumers.
So one thing that has been agreed is that siloing is bad generally. We need free flow. We need kind of more open collaboration between various countries and stuff. So then how do you assess right now the current administration's approach to 5G infrastructure, particularly around blocking Huawei and ZTE from participating in those markets? These are companies that could potentially offer more competition, more price, etc. So is this a good move? Do you think this is something that could actually hamper the progress of 5G in the US?
Yeah, well, I think you're asking me a question that is still being asked among governments. And so as a company, we wait on governments to give us the decisions and then we comply with them. I mean, we're going to comply with the requirements of any government in any jurisdiction we are in around the world. And so The governments are having conversations with each other about national security questions, and that's a very core responsibility of any government. And I appreciated what His Excellency said. One of the first things governments try to do is talk about people's safety and their security. And so what you'll see from, I think, any company in any jurisdiction, those conversations need to come to a conclusion. When they reach their conclusion, we'll comply.
I want to just switch tack as well to talk a little bit about the Egyptian example. And you said some of the challenges you've had is, of course, walking that fine line between, you know, keeping people safe, etc. But, you know, how do you assess the policy right now in Egypt and also countries in like the UAE as well, where they're trying to be open, they're trying to promote technology, but also you see sometimes blocks on, for example, Egypt issued a block on YouTube for a short time last year. A Google service, of course, WhatsApp video calling is blocked here as well. So how do you deal with this kind of like situation? How do you decide what should be censored and what shouldn't be? And your policy seems to be somewhere in between China on one hand and then kind of a more open Europe-US kind of situation. So how do you decide where that line is?
Right. Let me first get to a point that maybe was posed earlier on what would be the forum for the Arab countries to discuss together issues that we want to maybe unify our views and laws regarding like 5G, like data privacy. And we do have a council for ICT ministers in the Arab League that is active. I'm honored to be the secretary of this council. And we do discuss the unification of the legislations in this council. So there is a forum that is similar to the EU that is active. Back to your point, as I said earlier, there are a set of interests that we need to make sure that we address. First and foremost is the citizens' interests. And citizens' interests are diversified and multiple. And it's the obligation of any government to protect such interests and rights of the user. The right for free access, the right for securing the user's data, and then the content. And protecting the citizens from content that is way out of line of what we as societies are believing in and feel normal about. Yes, definitely there should be freedom on the internet. Yes, definitely people should post what they want, but then you need to protect also the other side, like you do in any other medium, like you do in press, like you do in TV or radio or any other medium that is accessible to everybody. The internet should enjoy the same protection as well.
And Karan, from your perspective, should it be Google who decides what content should be blocked or the government?
Look, I think the minister has phrased it actually very well, which is that this, there's always going to be the reconciliation of multiple different interests and stakeholders in this process. At the end of the day, we want to create an experience for our users that is a good experience, and so we spend a lot of time on multiple platforms on thinking about how do we best do that, and that involves our own set of content policies. I think the minister sort of described the necessity of balancing those multiple interests, the interests of consumers and so forth, and also flagged that at the end of the day, a vibrant, flourishing internet is going to be a key indicia or a key driver of economic growth, of investment. So there are multiple sort of factors that that are going to need to be balanced. And I think the essence of sort of the smart regulation concept that I was laying out before is that there's not going to be one size fits all here, right? What works in Germany may be very different from what works in Egypt, which may be very different from what works somewhere else. And look, we're prepared to engage in that discussion in each jurisdiction.
One big discussion point that's come up over the past month is this buzzword, the splinter net. And it's kind of not got a single definition yet, but it goes back to what we've been talking about, is the fragmentation of policy, and that you've got China on one hand, which has blocked a lot of US services, and then you've got other countries that have embraced a lot of the US technology services as well. And that could create a two-speed or two separate types of internet, one where it's a Chinese-owned, Chinese-run kind of internet, and one where it's predominantly the US and European services that are predominant as well. Margaret, from your point of view, you were once close to the White House, you engage a lot with the White House. Is this something that they are preparing for? Is this something the telecoms industry is preparing for as well? Or is it just a theory for now?
Well, I think that a lot of policymakers, and not just the ones in the US, are looking at the question of, is there going to be a sufficient interest by nation states who can achieve scale to go a different way? And then when there'll be another set of nation states that decide to go another. So that's something that we're looking at and we're watching. And it's good that it has a name. It has a jazzy name, so people will talk about it. And, exactly. And I think that that's something that is going to evolve. And so I don't want to get ahead of the evolution of it, but it is an articulated possibility. And of course, companies are looking at it, nations are looking at it, consumers are looking at it. I mean, I am a consumer. And so I don't know how interested I am in being cut off of certain parts of the world. And so I think that it's a place that we're going to continue to watch and engage in.
And presumably for an industry like yours, it would be a negative thing because it's an industry that relies on global standards, right? Like 5G is a global standard now that has been agreed. So that could potentially make your business very difficult if that is the way the internet goes.
Well, I think that you're going to hear from any business, and I'll repeat it the way Karan said it. There is always more opportunity when there's a harmonization that achieves scale. And so whether it's privacy legislation via the Arab League or harmonization of spectrum licenses in Europe with expanded durations, that is where capital is going to want to go because capital seeks efficiency. And so it is a balance of regulators deciding what's more important to us and what have we decided is more important to the citizens that we're going to put in these structures and limitations. So for us, yes, the more harmonization, the more opportunity, the more openness, that's going to be attractive to large companies, and it's also going to be attractive to capital. So from financial systems that aren't a company like AT&T.
Dr. Talat, from your perspective, do you see this as a realistic thing that could happen, and is it informing in any way your policy making?
Of course, the internet, one of the main advantages is offering and availing globalization. So you don't need to deprive people from that extremely important concretization of the phenomenon that the world has turned into a village because of the internet and because everybody can speak to everybody and trade with everybody. I think the prime guideline is the interests of the citizens, not whether we have a national internet or an international internet. Rather, what is the best interests of the users of that ecosystem, whatever it is, whether it's local or international. How do we protect those interests? How do we protect different users with diversified interests, diversified tastes, and diversified acceptability standards? And this should be the main reason. This is why I really like the idea that there's no one size fits all. If you watch TV in Europe, it's different than the TV you watch in the Middle East, different than the one you watch in Asia. So the internet should be the same. There's no one size that fits all.
Karan, your services, Google services, are obviously blocked in China, for example. Do you envisage a time where the split internet could play out, and you see countries having to make a choice, perhaps by using Chinese services or American or European services?
Look, I think the question actually ties into sort of a broader theme or trend or issue that we're seeing, which is, are we in an era of deglobalization? Are we in an era of growing, whether you want to protectionism or other forces that are going to break up the institutions that have really tied the world together so effectively. And certainly the internet is one that, see having been an incredible power driver of integration, of commerce, of people, of so much. So is that a world that we are anxious to move towards? No. I mean, we think that there's just been such incredible good that's been derived from the greater integration of the world, the billions who've been raised out of poverty, frankly the strengthening, I think, of many of the institutions of the world have been sort of driven by some of these trends. So does the idea of a broken up sort of hundreds of different standalone systems worry me? Yes. I mean, I think that's not a prospect that anyone would embrace. I think that the balance, the question is going to be how do you manage to maintain the synergies and the advantages of being part of that integration into a global network, while also recognizing that different countries, different places are going to have unique sets of demands. And I think that's what you're hearing references to. But as far as I also want to, I mean, we should be clear. I don't see, we're not at that point, right? What you're seeing actually globally is the substantial growth of the internet. You're seeing more users come on board. And, to go back to the point I was making to begin with, I think our greater challenge is how do you bring more people in to create that financially inclusive or technologically inclusive model going forward. I think that's a more immediate challenge, but the future that you describe is one of concern.
Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about is artificial intelligence, something you touched upon in your opening remarks. And it's an area that's a lot of worries for government because they're wondering what the actual fallout could be, but what are also the opportunities. So, Margaret, from your perspective, AI is something that's obviously important for networks as well. How do you regulate AI, or how can you regulate AI? Because it seems like quite an abstract thing to try and start to regulate. And does it even need regulation right now?
Yeah, so I appreciate this question. We actually, when we look at AI, we look at it as the ecosystem. So the connection of AI, the algorithms with quantum computing, within a high-speed network with low latency, 5G. So we see those as technologies that are going to want to operate together. And so we're doing what you would expect any large company to do. We have a set of AI principles that we're very proud of, that AI should be by people and for people, that it should be shared and accessible, and that it should be secure and ethical. And so we're having those conversations inside our company and saying, what does that mean for the AI projects that we're engaged in? And what does that mean for the partners we choose? And we also look and we see our regulators having a lot of those same discussions. I mean, there's some really great discussions happening right now in Europe on the ethical considerations of AI. So I think if you look at the opportunity of AI, it's coming to us. I mean, there are too many great things that it will bring. A lot around healthcare, a lot around efficiency of energy consumption. So there are these fantastic opportunities. But with that becomes, you can get some over-categorization of people that isn't something that is a benefit or a social good. And so, we are having these questions internally. We're having these conversations with regulators. And so what we would say is, it's an important contribution to the advancement and the quality of life of many people globally. So we're for it, and we're in it, and we're engaged. But we're also looking to see where the cautions are.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the AI it's self-regulated to some extent. Everyone's got their own kind of principles around its development. Do you think there should be more government oversight?
I think Margaret summed it all up. I think the AI is definitely a technology that we should all exploit and benefit from. There are several questions that any government should be concerned with. First and foremost is building a skill pool that is capable of utilizing this technology and to the best interest of the society. And then the prioritization of usage of AI. We need to make sure that we address this right, how and where to use AI to better manage our resources, to better predict our challenges and trying to embrace it. And then there is the ethical part of it, which is extremely important. And it concerns me that in many discussions and articles I read about AI, this is not maybe taking the right priority of it. Because very, very soon, machines will be making decisions for us and doing researches for us. And we need to make sure that the ethical facet of AI is well covered when we depend more and more on this extremely important technology.
Okay, we've got like 2 minutes left, so I want a super short answer from all three of you on this final question is, if we sat around a table right now with all the policymakers in the world and trying to hash out a perfect policy around any part of digital, whether it's privacy, whether it's tax, whether it's AI, what would be like the one top thing you'd say this needs to be in this piece of legislation? Karen, I want to start with you.
I mean, look, I would go back, not to be repetitive, but I would go back to the points that I sort of made in terms of the learnings that I think we can draw from the regulations of other sectors. I mean, our sector is incredibly dynamic, has enormous opportunities to create growth, but it is not unique. I mean, it has, there are lessons to have been learned. So I think critically important, if you have one critical, I think the importance of a collaborative process between the relevant stakeholders is key. I would be careful about moving forward too quickly with regulation before we understand the potential consequences of doing so. And look, I think we need to pay as much attention to building up the infrastructure and the skilling and so forth as we do the regulatory base.
Margaret?
Yeah, I was, my primary thoughts were how Karan finished his, which is I would be talking to the regulators and saying, this isn't just about the technology, because it's the technology in service of people and consumers. And so we really need to invest in the reskilling opportunities. We really need to be technology neutral, because I don't know, and no person knows and no company knows, all the amazing innovations that are going to be out there. And so we need to be as technology neutral as we can. We need to think about phased regulation only when necessary. And we really need to focus on this opportunity to bring more job growth, more reskilling consistent with the technology opportunities.
And Dr. Talat, final word from you.
I think we need to make sure that we as governments do achieve what I would call digital trust. The trust of our citizens in the digital world, the trust that the digital world would avail jobs, not deprive jobs, that the digital world would protect their privacy, the digital world would help them trade better, find better jobs, get better training, and get a free access to the global world.
Fantastic. Well, I've got another 4 pages of notes, so maybe we can reconvene at next year's World Government Summit to see where we are after 1 year. Thank you so much for today. That was a fantastic discussion. A round of applause for our great panelists.